So once again, good evening. Welcome to the 60th session on the Book of Acts. We are slowly making our way through what I thought was going to be a year-long study um, when I initially approached it. And well, we see how wrong I was with that. Before we get into Paul in Athens in Acts 17, I'd like to read Psalm 49. Psalm 49. Hear this, all peoples. Give ear, all inhabitants of the world, both low and high, rich and poor together. My mouth shall speak wisdom. The meditation of my heart shall be understanding. I will incline my ear to a proverb. I will solve my riddle to the music of the lyre. Why should I fear in times of trouble, when the iniquity of those who cheat me surrounds me? Those who trust in their wealth and boast of the abundance of their riches. Truly, no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life, for the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice that he should live on forever and never see the pit. For he sees that even the wise die, the fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wisdom to others. Their graves are their homes forever, their dwelling places to all generations. Though they called lands by their own names, man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. This is the path of those who have foolish confidence. Yet after them people approve of their boasts. Like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their form shall be consumed in Sheol, with no place to dwell. But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. Be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases. For when he dies, he will carry away nothing. His glory will not go down after him. For though while he lives, he counts himself blessed, and though you get praise when you do well for yourself, his soul will go to the generation of his fathers, who will never again see light. I read this psalm for the last verse. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. I read that because we are talking about Paul in Athens in Acts chapter 17, which seems to have been an unplanned journey on Paul's part. He had received earlier, not in this chapter, in chapter 16. Verse 9, Paul has a vision in the night of a man of Macedonia urging him to come to them and to help them, presumably to preach the gospel to them. And so Paul has been undertaking his second missionary journey, and he's gone into Macedonia, he's gone into Philippi, and the church was founded there. He went from Philippi to Thessalonica, and the church was started there, though his stay there was interrupted by the Jews who were jealous and uh, ran Paul out of town on a rail, essentially, after securing some money from Jason, with whom Paul had been lodging. Paul goes down to Berea. The Bereans are, as we talked last week, are more noble or more high-minded. They received the word with great eagerness and were diligently studying the scriptures to test the veracity of what Paul had to say. Well, the unpleasant Jews from Thessalonica hear that the word is being preached in Berea, and so they make the day and a half journey down to Berea to rile up the crowds there and make it difficult for Paul to continue the ministry. The brethren in Berea realize that Paul is their target, and they take him eastward toward the coast, as though he's going to board ship, and maybe he does board ship. Some of them accompany him, however he goes, and bring him into Achaia, into the city of Athens. A lot of people surmise, those, at least among those that I'm reading as I'm studying this, that Athens appears to be intended as escape from Thessalonian persecution. He's out, he's no longer within the province of Macedonia, and so they'll leave him alone. And now he's the Greeks' problem down south in the Grecian peninsula. And some surmise that Paul had intended to follow the Via Egnatia, this main Roman road, all the way to Rome in his pursuit of the Macedonian ministry here. Uh, he's going to cross the Adriatic Sea and eventually go over to Italy and into Rome, is what people say this was Paul's intention. We know that half a dozen years after these events, Paul writes to the church in Rome in Romans chapter 1, verse 13, saying that he's tried many times to come and see the church, see the brethren there in Rome, but he's been prevented. Paul will eventually get his wish and go to Rome. We'll read about that later on in the book of Acts. But Thessalonian hostility, not Thessalonian church hostility, but the unbelieving Jews in Thessalonica, their hostility and the recent edict by Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome may have had something to do with thwarting Paul in his efforts to get to Rome. So Paul finds himself in Athens. And as I said, this seems to have been an unplanned trip, a diversion from his original, what he had in his mind as how this was going to work out. And we could probably find a lesson there in how we think things ought to work out in our lives. And they don't often work out in those ways because God has other things in mind for us. And usually his ways are much better than our ways. I say usually because I'm a slow learner and sometimes still need to be convinced of the truth of that statement. But it appears that Paul really didn't intend to preach in Athens. He instructs those who bring him to Athens to send Silas and Timothy to him, who stayed up in Berea, and presumably Luke as well. But while he's in Athens, he's walking around and he's looking, he's taking in, he's doing the touristy things. He's seeing the sights, but the sights stir him to anger. And in his upset, he goes into the synagogue and begins teaching the Jews there and the God-fearing Gentiles who are there. And then he goes into the marketplace and he starts sharing the gospel with just anybody and everybody who he can waylay and stop and get a minute of their time to speak to them, which is going to get him into a little bit of trouble. And we'll see that as we get a little further this evening. When we read First Thessalonians, we can sort of kind of trace the movements of Paul and Silas and Timothy as all of these things are going on. We're told in First Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 17 to 18, that Paul intended to return back to Thessalonica. It was his goal to go back to Thessalonica and continue and encourage the brethren there, but Satan hindered him, we're told. How Satan hindered him? Unknown, possibly through the unbelieving Jews. We're told in Acts chapter 17 and verse 15 that he sends for Timothy and Silas when he is in Athens, and they come down to him. And it seems that he immediately turns Timothy around and sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to encourage the brethren there. We read about that in First Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And some people presume that he sent Silas along with Timothy to go north up to Thessalonica, and then Silas continued on eastward back over to Philippi, where he ministered to the church there, received a gift for Paul from Philippi, and brings that gift, picks up Timothy in Thessalonica, and then goes and meets Paul in Corinth, which we read about in Acts chapter 18 and verse 5, when Silas and Timothy come back to Paul. Paul spends a little bit of time in Athens. We'll read about it over the course of the next couple of weeks here, and then crosses the Bay of Corinth and goes into Corinth, where he's going to stay for a considerable amount of time. But I want to read for you these verses. We'll make a few comments about Athens, the city, We'll make a few comments about the philosophers that Paul encounters. And like I said before we started the class, we may actually end early. Haha. So, Acts chapter 17, verses 16 to 21. Now, while Paul was waiting for them, and that's Silas and Timothy, read the verse above it. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. I need to make a note because I was reminded of something that I did not write down when I wrote my notes. So you get to listen to me write. And hopefully I know what was pen scratching that I just wrote there means when I get to page 5 of the notes. We'll see. So Athens. Athens is capital of modern day Greece. Athens is a city that lay roughly 5 miles inland from the nearest port. And so it's possible that Paul took ship from east of Berea, numerous ports there, and sailed south with the companions from the church in Berea, and then made the journey on foot into Athens. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Legend says that Athens was found by Theseus, who was the hero of Attica. Attica is the name for the Grecian peninsula, that triangle-shaped sort of thing. If you look at a map and you see the pointy part of Greece, that's and pointy part is a relative term. You have to have an imagination to see the point. You might have to have an imagination to get the point of this class, but I'll leave that to your discretion or your decision. The Theseus of Attica slew a Minotaur and conquered the Amazons, and then founded the city of Athens, which was named in honor of the goddess Athena. That's Greek mythology and Greek legends. When you see a myth, the word myth means liter in the literature definition of a myth is an origin story. Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories that tell of, how the leopard got his spots, or, I don't know if he wrote that one, but those are origin stories. They're myths. Some can look at Genesis chapter 1 and say, well, that's the creation myth because it is the origin story that the Bible presents for creation. Unfortunately, when we hear the term myth, we think fable. We equate it with something not true. We equate it with something false, and so generally try to avoid using that term when you're speaking about biblical things. In the 5th century BC, Persia attempted to conquer Greece and was repelled largely due to the contributions of Athens to the war effort. And once Persia was driven off, Greece quickly became a maritime empire. They were the leading sea traders. I mean, if you look at Greece, it's almost nothing but water around it. It's got miles and miles and miles of coastland. And they had a rather large navy, though it wouldn't have been called a navy at the time, but they really invested hard in shipping and in trade through shipping. Athens reached its height, the height of its prominence during the reign of Pericles around 495 to 429 BC. So many, many years before Jesus. During the reign of Pericles, the Parthenon was built. Numerous other temples and many of the grand buildings, ruins of which still stand today, were built. And because of Greece, the rise of it being a center of culture, Greece became a center of learning. It became the center of learning, philosophy, science, and rhetoric culture. It attracted intellectuals from all over the world. Many names that are fairly well known, either taught in Greece or taught in Athens, rather, or were somehow associated with the schools in Athens. Socrates, from 470 to 399 BC. That's a name probably everybody has heard. Socrates, he taught in Athens. Plato also taught there, 428 BC to 348 BC. Aristotle, not a native Athenian, but he taught in Athens as well, and um, he was the tutor of Alexander the Great, who was the son of Philip II of Macedon, who um, was one of those who conquered Athens at one point. Epicurus, we read about the Epicureans. Epicurus, the philosopher Epicurus, he taught in Athens 342 to 270 BC, and his counterpart, the other side of the Epicurean and Stoic coin, Zeno was in Athens 340 to 263 BC. So at the same time, these two competing schools of thought are going on in Athens, and they still held prevalence in Paul's time, along with the school of Plato and one other, the name of which I forget. Athens was conquered in 338 BC by Philip II of Macedonia, but that conquest only served to spread Athenian culture into the world because Alexander the Great went on his worldwide campaign. And with him, he took Athenian culture. He brought the Greek language to the entire world. One of his aims, it seemed to be, was to reverse the what happened to the Tower of Babel and make Greek be the universal language of the world. Around the time when Paul was there, most of the world at large, most of the Roman Empire would speak Greek. They'd have their own native languages, understand, but they would also speak Greek. Uh, the Romans conquered Athens in 146 BC, but the Romans loved everything Greek. If you look at Roman architecture, you will notice many similarities between Roman architecture and Grecian architecture. If you study the Roman pantheon of gods, you will find that they have Grecian counterparts, or they are the same gods that the Greeks believed in, only they're given Roman names, Zeus and Jupiter, um, and several of the others that the Romans essentially stole everything that the Greeks did and put their own stamp of, hey, this is Rome's approval on it. So when they conquered Athens, they immediately made the city a free city, and it remained a center of, at the height of Rome's power, it still was the place where people went to learn. It still was the place that people thought of when they thought of culture and refined individuality. By the time Paul comes to Athens, though, the city is in sharp decline. A lot of its wealth is gone. Um, it had lost most of its importance. Estimates of its population in the time of Paul are anywhere between 10,000 and maybe 20, 25-ish thousand people. 25 would probably be pushing it. And the largest percentage of those people would have been associated with the universities, with the schools there in Athens. And so that's the setting into which Paul comes. And we're told in verse 16 that as Paul is waiting for his companions to catch up with him, He's walking around the city. He's seeing a whole bunch of idols. And Luke uses a very strong word here to explain how Paul feels, saying he was provoked. Well, why was he provoked? There was a Greek traveler and geographer named Pausanias who lived in the second century AD, who was probably the father of modern tour guide books. He wrote of numerous places that he would go and things that you would see there, and a lot of that writing still exists. Dr. Craig Keener, in his extremely immense commentary on Acts, spends 4 pages describing the idols that Paul would have seen upon entering Acts. I want to read for you just a couple of paragraphs. I'm not going to read the entire 4 pages because it would take the rest of the class time. But it's sort of staggering when you hear one after another being heaped up one on top of another. So from his writings, Pausanias, Keener says that he was a reliable mid-second century tour guide. Most of what he reports would have also been visible earlier in Paul's day. As soon as one entered Athens, one would see the building for processions, the Temple of Demeter, containing images of Demeter and Persephone, and a torchbearer relevant to the mysteries, and soon after see a statue of Poseidon, whom the Romans named Neptune. A nearby portico contains sanctuaries, a gymnasium devoted to Hermes, a house used for Dionysus worship, and images there of Athena, the healer, Zeus, the Muses, and Apollo. After the area sacred to Apollo came another building containing clay statues of various deities, including Dionysius. Next to the statue of Demosthenes, the orator was a shrine for Ares, which contained not only an image of Arethes, but also one of Athena and two of Ares' paramour, Aphrodite, with images of Heracles and Apollo nearby. Near Next was a temple of Hephaestus, and then Aphrodite was follows that. Let's see, there was also a sanctuary for Dioscuri, a temple of Serapis, near it a temple of Eleatha. Hadrian later dedicated a temple of Olympian Zeus with a statue of Zeus that was larger than any other statue except those in Rome and Rhodes. Let's see, near the temple of Zeus was the temple of Delphine and Apollo, followed by a temple to Aphrodite. From the Praetorium, a symbolic city center, supposedly founded by Theseus, were shrines to the tripods. Near them was another temple of Dionysus. Dionysus's sanctuary had two statues of Dionysus. I don't know why you need two statues. Let's see, they come a little bit further on, you come to a sanctuary of Asclepius, and further along the temple of Themis and the sanctuary of the earth and a sanctuary of Demeter, and he goes on for another 3 pages. One idol after another. Josephus, in his writings, notes remarks on how religious the Athenians were, noting that they had images and they're up to their hips in idols. In other words, you can't throw a stone without hitting an idol there. So Luke uses this very strong word, says that Paul, while waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him. That word is used only twice in the New Testament. Here and in Acts chapter 15, verse 39, when it talks about the intensity of the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas overtaking John Mark on them for this second missionary journey, and it eventually leads to Paul and Barnabas separating, Barnabas taking Mark and going back to Cyprus to visit the churches they founded there, and Paul taking Silas and going north toward Tarsus. But this word is used a bunch of times in the Old Testament. I'll look at just a couple of the verses. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 18. In Deuteronomy 9, verse 18, we read, not verse 17, verse 18. And this is Moses talking to the people about the sin with the golden calf, saying that he lay prostrate before the Lord as before. 40 days and 40 nights I ate neither bread nor drank water because of all of the sin that you had committed in doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. There's that word, to provoke. Isaiah 65 and verse 3, and I'm going to read from verse 1 down to verse 3. Isaiah 65, verse 1. I was ready to be sought by those who did not ask for me. This is God speaking. I was ready to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here am I, to a nation that was not called by my name. I spread out my hands all the day to a rebellious people who walk in the way that is not good, following their own devices, a people who provoke me to my face continually, sacrificing in gardens and making offerings on bricks. And a bunch of other times it's used in the Old Testament, frequently translated as provoke, sometimes translated as wrath. And it's speaking of how God feels when his people chase after idols. We can take a lesson from that. We might say that our sin is little, our sin is small. My sins aren't all that bad. I can justify not all of my sins, obviously, but I can justify some of them in my humanistic way of thinking. But that sin provokes God, it angers him. And so Paul is angered by what he is seeing there as he's walking around in Athens. And it makes me wonder, are we equally angered by the sin that we see in the world? Or have we become sort of inured to it, where we just sort of shrug our shoulders and say, that's just people being people, and we understand that people are sinful? Or does listening to the news upset you when you hear about man's inhumanity to man and the terrible things, the violence and the awful things that people do to other people? I think we should be provoked. I think we should be upset. Habakkuk in Habakkuk chapter 1 verses 2 to 4 says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity?" That's a good question. Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. The law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, and justice goes forth paralyzed, or not paralyzed, perverted. Habakkuk's complaint is everywhere I look, I see sin, and he's upset about it. God says, don't worry, I've got a solution named Babylon. They're going to come down and they're going to take care of Jerusalem once and for all. Are we equally upset by the sin that we see in this world? Just food for thought. You don't have to answer the question because sin is certainly rampant in its nature in this world. So Paul's response to being provoked by the idols is to go on, probably on a Sabbath, go into the synagogue as he's waiting for Timothy and Silas to show up. And he begins reasoning with the Jews and the devout people, the Greeks. I think the NIV says, I just happen to have one here. Let's see. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. I did not look in the Greek to see if God-fearing Greeks is in there. At least I don't think I did. I don't remember. But that captures the sense of it. You have the Jews who are attached to the synagogue there, and then you have the God-fearing Gentiles around them that are drawn into this, drawn in to hear about the God of the Jews and come to belief in that God of the Jews and pattern their lives after following the law of Moses. So Paul goes in and he reasons. He will write later, late in life, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 25, saying that opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth. I like that idea of gently instructed. Peter says much the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, where he says, "In your heart set apart Christ Jesus as Lord, always being ready to give answer for the hope that is within you, yet do this gently." Not pick up your Bible and smack them across the head, not ram it down their throat, or point at them and say, you're wrong, you're living in sin, and I'm here to set you straight. You're welcome. Here I am to be a blessing for you, a forceful blessing, whether you like it or not. But answer them gently. I think gentleness is hard to do, especially especially when you're provoked by the sin that you see. But then you go to Jesus and you look at Jesus. Think of the woman taken in the very act of adultery in John chapter 8 and brought before Jesus. Did Jesus know she was guilty? Yes, he did. Absolutely, he did. He didn't side with the Jews and say, "Stone her now." They would have called him out on that anyway because they brought this woman to him as a trap. But in the end, when they'd all dispersed after he said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," and they all leave, and it's just Jesus and the woman, he doesn't dress her down. He doesn't berate her for her sin. He says, "Is there nobody here to condemn you?" She says, "No one, Lord." And he says, "I don't condemn you either. Go, and from now on, sin no more." A God of second chances, a God who looks at sin and doesn't want to club you with a two by four. Psalm 103, somewhere in around verse, I'll get it wrong, six-ish, thereabouts, Lee says that God remembers our frame. He knows that we're dust. Dust is weak. Nobody builds a house out of dust. Nobody builds suspension bridges out of dust. You want something strong for those things. God understands that we're weak. The writer of Hebrews says, the end of Hebrews chapter 4, the beginning part of Hebrews chapter 5, that we have a high priest in Jesus who's able to sympathize with us in our weaknesses because he was tempted like we are in every way, yet was without sin. Jesus doesn't want to yell at you for your sin. He wants to encourage you to do better. He wants to take you by the hand and lead you to a better path. If Jesus is going to take the gentle approach, then who am I to grab Peter Archibald by the lapels of his jacket and shake him and say, "Peter, you got to stop sinning"? I think Peter would prefer the gentle approach. He'd rather sit down and talk with Jesus about it because he understands Jesus is going to guide him in love, and hopefully we too can pattern ourselves after him. Uh, that was a digression. Sorry, got away from my notes. So Paul reasons with the Jews in the synagogue. He reasons with the people in the marketplace. And Luke is doing something very subtle that I didn't realize until I read through 4 or 5 commentaries that were pointing at this and saying, "Hey, there's hints here if you're looking." Paul is reasoning in the marketplace with the philosophers and is showing that Paul is able to stand on equal footing with the intellectuals of his day, that he's not intimidated by these men of great learning and great knowledge. Um, and there are even hints that Luke is kind of, sort of, almost presenting Paul as a new Socrates. We'll see that in a couple of verses when you look at the accusation that's leveled against Paul. in their questioning here. So, do you know people who are too smart for their own good? People who are too smart for the gospel or too smart to accept the gospel? I've known a few very, very intelligent individuals who could not accept the gospel because it didn't make sense to them. It did not fit their mental image of what logic is like. To them, the gospel was foolishness. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, saying that the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. See Romans 1, verse 16 for that. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. You remember the psalm that I read, Psalm 49? Go back and read the last verse of that. The pomp of people does not stand, and their understanding doesn't stand up. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For the Jews demand signs, Greeks seek wisdom. And that's what Paul's encountering here in Athens. Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. I love that last verse. God at his dumbest is way, way, way smarter and wiser than any of us. God at his most foolish is wiser than we are in our wisest. And so Paul is reasoning in a couple of places here. He's reasoning in the synagogue where he's going to meet a receptive audience because the Jews are the Jew, he's a fellow Jew, and they're going to understand the things that he's talking about. And he reasons in the marketplace, the agora. The agora was the central marketplace for Athens. It was really the city center, the hub of all the activity that's going on. And the central plaza was called the Painted Stoa in Greek. It was built in the 470s BC, so it had been there for a very long time. And it was used as a meeting place by many, many people, including the philosophers. And two groups of those philosophers are intrigued by what Paul has to say in verse 18. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And that word conversed, let me see what the NIV says, uh, can mean argued. Let's see. Okay, the NIV says a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. It can be translated that way too. It's it's a challenging conversation, not meaning a difficult conversation, but a conversation that is a challenge of what you're saying. Bill Moore raises the point that the sky is blue, and I say, is it really now, Bill? That's me beginning engaging in a debate with him and challenging his statement that the sky is indeed blue. So we have these two groups, the Epicureans and the Stoics. I want to talk for just a minute about them so that we can get a better understanding of who they are. Um, Athens was the home of the schools of rival schools of philosophy. The Epicureans uh, were the followers of Epicurus, philosopher that I mentioned earlier earlier tonight. They held that pleasure was the chief goal of life. But when I say pleasure, I don't mean the fleshly pleasures. It's not sensual pleasure. It's not pleasure from sex. It's not pleasure from eating, but pleasure uh, of a higher enlightenment, if you will. The pleasure most, they taught that the pleasure most worth enjoying was a life a life of tranquility. Wow. Free from pain, disturbing passions, and superstitious fears and anxiety about death. In their philosophical outlook, the gods modeled that quality. The gods were aloof and distant, but the gods lived in luxury. They lived in tranquility. They lived in splendor. They had very little to do with the events of human beings. They don't deny the existence of of the gods, but they argued that the gods took no interest in the lives of human because they had everything they needed. Why would they need to be bothered with people? People are messy. You probably have seen that in your own life. People are messy. We come with our own messes and our own baggage, and we make a mess of things. And the gods wanted nothing to do with that because they had what they needed. Diogenes, who was an Epicurean uh, around AD 200, sums up the Epicurean belief in a motto that he wrote: Nothing to fear in God, nothing to feel in death. Good, that is pleasure, can be attained, and evil, that is pain, can be endured. Nothing to fear in God, nothing to feel in death. Good can be attained, evil can be endured. And that was the center, that was the crux of Epicurean belief. They pursued um, pleasure, but not through engaging in the competitive life. That is not in, if I can outachieve Mike Hebert in life, it makes me feel good about myself. I've reached a high level of pleasure. No, that wasn't the thought. It was this idea of avoiding stress, avoiding emotional turmoils, which is kind of sort of like the Stoics too. They're a little more alike than they are dissimilar. But the Epicureans are going after, they're seeking pleasure. The Stoics were seeking logic. They were seeking something rational. Zeno was the founder of Stoicism, and the name comes from the column. He would sit under this portico, a stoa, and he would teach. And so it became known as Stoicism. Stoicism. Uh, he habitually taught in the agora where Paul is, but this was hundreds and hundreds of years previously. But their teaching focused on living harmoniously with nature and emphasizing the rationality of a human being and saying that people are self-sufficient. They didn't not believe in gods, but they didn't believe the gods were spirits. They believed the gods were tangible, the things you could see and touch. The gods were in the trees, the gods were in the rocks, the gods were in the people. Um, they thought of God as the world soul, the whole world being the greater God. They taught that nothing had existence outside of the material world. If you couldn't see it, if you couldn't touch it, if you could not sense it somehow, then it didn't exist. Uh, and they were fatalists. Everything that happened um, according to providence, that is fate, for the good of the world, for the greater good of the world. And so if we pick a tragedy, Bill Moore drops his coffee pot full of coffee in the morning and it shatters on the floor, they would say that was for the greater good of the world. And they would expect Bill to not be upset about that, but to bear it stoically. He's shaking his head. And accept that it was meant to happen that way. Where Bill would say, no, coffee was meant to be drunk, and then I would get pleasure from it, and they'd accuse him of being an Epicurean. They didn't believe that evil existed, and illness, disaster were part of fate. And so they had their purpose for good in the world. Paul writes later on in some of his letters, he'll write in the letter to the Colossians about the ones who say, do not taste, do not touch, do not don't do these things. Adhering more to a Stoic line of thought, the idea of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die, adhering to more of an Epicurean thought. And you'll encounter both of those ideas in Paul's writing. But members of both schools here are coming up to Paul and they're listening to what he has to say and they're commenting back and forth on it. It's interesting. They say two things about Paul in verse 18. One is, what does this babbler want to say? The Greek word that's used there for babbler is a word that refers to a bird that is picking up and dropping seeds, going from one little thing to another thing, here and there and everywhere real quickly. That is that Paul has picked up little bits and pieces of high sounding intellectual thought, but doesn't really have much knowledge behind it. It's like I could give you my thoughts on string theory and physics, but I have absolutely no knowledge to back up anything that I'm saying. It would just be nothing but words. It would be me babbling, and it would all be nonsense. Things that I've heard that I'm parroting back to you, and I don't really understand what they mean. It's like using a word that I don't know the meaning of. I've got a fairly decent vocabulary, I think, but sometimes I find that I use words thinking they mean one thing when actually they don't mean the thing that I'm thinking they mean. And they mean something else when I go and I look them up and I feel kind of foolish. So he's babbling. He doesn't have any real knowledge of what he's saying. The other thing that they say is that he's a preacher of foreign divinities. That's a little more serious. If you read what they're saying here, it seems that these philosophers have concluded that Paul is talking about a God named Jesus and his consort named Resurrection. They would draw this conclusion because the Greek word for resurrection is the word Anastasia, which is in the feminine in Greek. He's speaking about foreign divinities, Jesu and Anastasia. The charge that was leveled against Socrates that eventually led to his death was that he was a preacher of foreign divinities, that he was stirring up people and teaching about gods in competition with, or gods other than the accepted gods in the Greek pantheon. And so it seems like they're leveling this same sort of thing at Paul. He's talking about these strange gods, this God Jesus and this divine being named Resurrection. And the NIV says they took him and brought him to the Areopagus. That the word there for took can mean simply to lead somebody. Acts chapter 9 and verse 27, after Saul has been converted to Christianity and he goes up to see the apostles in Jerusalem, they didn't want to have anything to do with him, the people there. In verse 26, they were afraid of him, but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. Barnabas doesn't grab him and drag him into the apostles. He leads Paul to the apostles. It can also mean to seize somebody. Acts chapter 16 and verse 19. Let's see. After Paul casts a demon out of the girl who was following them around, saying these men are servants of the Most High God, we're told in verse 19 of Acts 16, when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And so it has both senses. I can either lead you gently to the Areopagus or I can seize you and bring you to the Areopagus. The way I'm reading this, I'm leaning more toward that second meaning, that they take Paul forcefully and they bring him into the Areopagus. Well, what's the Areopagus? The Areopagus to this day is the name for the Supreme Court in Greece. The highest court of the land is still the Areopagus. This is the ruling officials, whatever officials they had at this time, and they bring Paul there to have him give the message, but it's phrased in a question. It's not really a hostile question. At least I can't read it that way. I don't know. I may be trying to push the Socrates thing a little bit too hard, and that's entirely possible. Said, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know what these things, we wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Paul is here before the Athenian Council of Ares, and he's going to be able to explain his message, but he's explaining this message before the people who, from which he can either receive freedom to preach in the city or he can be censured and told, no, you can't speak anymore in this message and or in this name rather. And it could be a harsher censuring than just simply saying no. Um, they put one philosopher to death. Well, he killed himself by drinking hemlock, but one philosopher died for preaching foreign divinities. Now Paul is standing before them with the same uh, charge, and I'm putting that in quotes because I don't know if it really is a charge, laid at his feet. And then Luke says something very interesting. He inserts this parenthetical statement in verse 21, which is where we're going to end. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. Luke uses the most formal, cultured Greek possible to write this statement. Some have said of that statement it is the most cultured thing you find in the Bible because of the formal nature in which it is written. I think he's almost poking fun at them by rising to their elevated status in saying this about them. His comment here that the Athenians do nothing but talk about and listen to the latest ideas. Um, Even the Athenians said this about themselves. Cleon, a 5th century BC politician and general, said, "You are the best people at being deceived by something new that is said." Um, Demosthenes, who I mentioned earlier, I think from 384 to 322 BC, berated the Athenians as when Philip the second of Macedon was rising to power and posing a threat to Athens and eventually conquered them, accused them of trying to talk when they should have been going to action. They're talking about things instead of rising into action. Well, what should we do? Well, we're going to do this. We'll do this. We'll do this. I've got this new idea. We could approach it this way, and they end up talking and doing nothing, so that he conquers them without really having to fight much. Um, this idea that the people of Athens were obsessed with new things was known throughout the world, throughout Macedonia and elsewhere. So what about us? What about the world we live in? How much is the world that we're part of engaged in the pursuit of the things that are new? It's an interesting question. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and I meant to put my marker there, but I didn't. Isaiah, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 9 through 11. What has been, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things. yet to be among those who come after. And you might argue, well, Solomon, if Solomon had seen an iPhone 10, and I'm not an iPhone person, I know that that's not the most recent iteration of the iPhone. He would have said that was something new, right? Well, yes and no. There really isn't anything new. When you look at how people act and behave, we still chase the same things that people ages ago chased. We still think the same way people ages ago thought. We might have new and more advanced toys to play with and ways to entertain ourselves, but they had ways to entertain themselves too. Their iPhones may have been made out of stone and didn't have real good reception, but they still had things that they treasured, things that they pursued, things that they sought after. There really isn't anything new. People are people. And trying to find this new thing that's going to satisfy ultimately ends up not satisfying because there's only one thing that satisfies, and that's Jesus. He's the only thing that brings true, lasting value to any of us in our lives. And that's where I'm going to end this evening. Next week, we will get into Paul's answers. He stands up in the Areopagus and addresses them, and we'll probably finish out, well, maybe we'll strive to finish out the chapter, but that's for next week. I'm going to go ahead now and stop the recording.